Jeremiah Walker tightened his grip on the shuttle's safety harness as they descended toward Zeltria Prime. The soft hum of the ship's engines did little to calm his nerves, and the sight of the alien planet's luminous cityscapes through the window only made him more aware of the leap he was taking. It wasn't his first time off-world, but it was his first time meeting the parents of someone who wasn't human. The idea of sitting down with Lyra's family, two of Zeltria's most respected minds, made his stomach churn more than the turbulence. "Jeremiah, relax," Lyra said from the seat beside him, her voice calm and melodic. "They're not as intimidating as you think." He glanced over, trying to read her expression. "That's easy for you to say. They're your parents." She smiled, a soft tilt of her lips that only made her even more striking. Her sea-green skin and shimmering violet eyes were as alien as they were beautiful. "You don't have to prove anything. Just be yourself." "Being myself is the problem," he muttered. "What if I say something stupid?" Lyra laughed, a sound that seemed to ease some of his tension. "You'll be fine. They're curious about you, that's all. And maybe a bit protective. But once they see why I care about you, they'll warm up." Jeremiah let out a breath. "No pressure then." When they landed, the Zeltrian attendants ushered them into an elegant aircar that whisked them toward the estate. Jeremiah spent the ride staring out the window at the crystalline spires and bioluminescent gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. Every building shimmered, catching the light of the two suns overhead. It was a world that seemed to pulse with life, a sharp contrast to the practical, metallic cities of Earth. Lyra reached over, resting her hand on his. "Breathe, Jeremiah. My father might act serious, but he's fair. And my mother, well, she's the one who suggested this dinner. If she didn't think you were worth it, we wouldn't be here." "I guess that's reassuring," he said, though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. The aircar glided to a stop in front of a sprawling crystalline mansion that sparkled like it had been carved from a single giant gemstone. The building's design was all sweeping curves and arching towers, with patches of greenery woven into the structure. It looked more like a piece of art than a home. As they stepped out, the faint hum of energy fields blended with the distant sounds of alien wildlife. For a moment, Jeremiah just stood there, taking it all in. Lyra tugged his hand. "Come on. They're waiting." They entered through a towering archway, the walls glowing softly with a light that seemed to come from within the structure itself. The interior was just as impressive, translucent floors, flowing streams of water running along the walls, and clusters of floating orbs that cast a warm, welcoming glow. And there, standing in the center of it all, were Lyra's parents. Iovala, her mother, had the same sea-green skin as Lyra, but her features were sharper, her eyes a piercing shade of gold. She wore a flowing, translucent robe that caught the light with every step. Threxer, Lyra's father, was taller, his deep blue skin and silver eyes giving him a commanding presence. He looked Jeremiah up and down, his expression unreadable, before nodding in greeting. "Jeremiah Walker," Threxer said, his voice smooth but edged with a hint of curiosity. "Welcome to our home." "Thank you," Jeremiah managed, his mouth dry. "It's an honor to be here." Iovala stepped forward, her gaze more inquisitive than cold. "Lyra has told us much about you. I hope you'll forgive our curiosity." "Not at all," he said quickly. I hope I can answer whatever questions you have." "Good," Threxer said, gesturing toward the dining area. "Let's talk over a meal." Jeremiah followed them into a room that was part dining hall, part living artwork. The table seemed to float, with dishes that refracted light like prisms. Lyra took a seat beside him, giving him a reassuring smile as her parents settled across from them. The meal began with polite conversation. Iovala asked about Earth's cities, its cultural traditions, and the state of human technological progress. Jeremiah did his best to answer without sounding completely out of his depth. He described Earth's bustling metropolises, its artistic diversity, and the advances humanity had made in space travel. Threxer listened intently, occasionally nodding but rarely showing much emotion. As the meal progressed, the questions grew more specific. Iovala asked about human approaches to governance and ethics, while Threxer inquired about military strategy and the human perspective on interstellar diplomacy. Jeremiah realized they weren't just testing his knowledge, they were gauging his values. It was less about whether he could impress them and more about whether they could trust him to care for their daughter. Despite the pressure, Jeremiah found himself easing into the discussion. He wasn't a politician or a scientist, but he was honest and he spoke from the heart. He told them about his work on Earth, his family, and why he had come to Zeltria in the first place. When he spoke about Lyra, about how much he admired her courage, intelligence, and compassion, he noticed her parents exchanging a glance. For the first time, Threxer's stern expression softened ever so slightly. Then, just as the tension began to dissipate, Threxer brought up the family's cherished tradition, chess. We've always believed a game of wits reveals much about a person, Threxer said, gesturing toward a smaller table where a holographic chessboard had materialized. Would you indulge me in a match? Jeremiah hesitated. He enjoyed chess, but Zeltrian chess was a completely different beast. The board wasn't flat, and the pieces weren't static. They shifted between dimensions, their forms changing based on the player's moves. He had seen Lyra practice once, and it had left him thoroughly confused. But saying no felt like admitting defeat before the game even began. Of course, he said, rising from his seat. I'll do my best. Lyra touched his arm as he passed, her voice low. Just focus on the patterns. You'll be fine. The game started slowly. Threxer moved his pieces with calculated precision, setting up a web of potential threats. Jeremiah struggled at first, his mind racing to keep up with the shifting board. The pieces didn't behave the way he expected, and every time he thought he understood the rules, a new layer of complexity emerged. Iovala and Lyra watched silently from the sidelines. Jeremiah felt their eyes on him as he made his moves, trying to anticipate Threxer's strategies. He knew he was outmatched. Threxer had decades of experience, a mind honed by countless games. But Jeremiah had something else, perseverance. He refused to give up even as the board seemed to twist against him. As the minutes turned into hours, something changed. Jeremiah started to notice patterns, subtle shifts in the pieces that hinted at their potential moves. He began to anticipate Threxer's traps, countering them with moves that surprised even himself. The room grew quieter as the game stretched on, the air thick with concentration. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Threxer leaned back in his chair. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint of something in his silver eyes. Was it approval? Jeremiah wasn't sure. All he knew was that he hadn't completely embarrassed himself. Well played, Threxer said, his voice calm but carrying a note of respect. Few humans would have lasted this long. Jeremiah let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Thank you. I'm still learning. Threxer nodded, rising from his seat. You have potential. That much is clear. Iovala approached, her gaze softer than it had been at the start. Jeremiah, thank you for indulging our traditions. It means a great deal to us. Jeremiah glanced at Lyra, who was smiling at him in a way that made his heart race. He might not have won the game, but he felt he had gained something far more important, a chance. It was a week after the fateful chess match, and Jeremiah still couldn't stop thinking about it. The rules had been so foreign, so confounding, yet somehow he'd stumbled through, guided by a mix of instinct, sheer will, and Lyra's quiet encouragement. Now, seated at a smaller table on the open balcony of the crystalline estate, he stared down at the holographic board. The pieces shimmered, their forms morphing slightly each time he glanced away. He sighed and rested his head in his hands. I'm never going to figure this out, he muttered under his breath. Not with that attitude, Lyra teased as she approached, holding a tray of fruit-like objects that sparkled faintly. She set it down beside him and took the chair opposite. Did my father really break your spirit that badly? Break my spirit? Jeremiah looked up, incredulous. No, he just demolished any illusion I had of being clever. It's like the pieces move randomly, except it's not random because he always knows exactly where they're going. Lyra laughed and reached out to touch his hand. It's not random at all. It's about recognizing patterns, thinking several steps ahead. My father has been playing since before I was born. Of course he's good. Jeremiah shook his head. Good? Lyra, he's practically a chess god. Meanwhile, I barely understand what half the pieces even do. She gave him a sympathetic smile. Then let's start there. We can break it down, piece by piece. I'll show you how they move and how the board shifts. Jeremiah studied her for a moment, searching for any hint of pity, but all he saw was encouragement. You're really going to teach me? He asked. Of course, she said. If you're serious about it, we can start right now. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and he found himself nodding. All right, but I'm warning you, I'm a terrible student. Good thing I'm a patient teacher, Lyra replied with a wink. She reached out and tapped one of the hovering pieces. It glowed faintly, and a series of translucent lines appeared, indicating possible moves. Let's start with this one. We call it the Strider. It moves along these paths, and it can phase through one other piece per turn, but only if it lands on a node that's aligned with it. Wait. Jeremiah held up a hand. Phasing? Nodes? Aligned with what? She grinned. Just follow the lines for now. The rules will make more sense as we go. Over the next hour, Lyra explained the movements of each piece and the dynamics of the board's shifting layers. The holographic grid wasn't static, it pulsed and morphed as moves were made, creating new pathways and closing others. Jeremiah struggled to keep up, but Lyra patiently repeated explanations, guiding him through the logic of the game. With each move, he felt a small piece of the puzzle clicking into place. So, the strider can jump, but it's limited by the alignment of these nodes, he said, tentatively moving the piece. And if I land here, it opens this path for my scout? Lyra nodded. Exactly. You're starting to see it now. He let out a low whistle. This is a lot. How does your father do this so effortlessly? Practice, she said simply. It's second nature to him now. But even he started out just like you, confused, frustrated, probably ready to give up. Jeremiah looked skeptical. I find that hard to believe. Lyra laughed. I promise it's true. My mother loves to tell the story of how he lost his first 20 matches to her before he finally started winning. 20? Jeremiah leaned back, surprised. That makes me feel a little better. See? There's hope for you yet. They spent the rest of the afternoon playing mock matches, each one a little more structured than the last. Lyra challenged him to think several moves ahead, to anticipate her strategies, and to adapt when the board shifted against him. At first, he made every mistake possible, falling into traps, missing obvious opportunities, even forgetting basic rules. But Lyra never scolded him. She simply pointed out what he could do differently next time. All right, try that move again, she said, leaning forward and pointing to the strider. Now, what happens if I place my sentinel here? Jeremiah frowned and studied the board. The sentinel was one of the most complex pieces, capable of creating temporary barriers that altered the entire game dynamic. If Lyra placed it there, it would block his strider's route to a crucial node. But if he moved his scout first— Wait, I can do this, he said, moving his scout to intercept her sentinel's path. If I go here, it cuts off your sentinel before it can block my strider. Lyra's smile widened. Exactly. You're starting to think ahead. He leaned back, grinning. Well, it only took me about 1,000 tries. Every match teaches you something, Lyra said. Even losing. Jeremiah looked at her, the sunlight catching the faint shimmer of her skin. You're a good teacher, you know that? She blushed slightly, glancing away. I've had a good student. You're just saying that because you're obligated to, he teased. No, I mean it. She met his gaze, her expression earnest. You're not giving up, even though this is completely alien to you. That's impressive. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the board forgotten. Jeremiah felt a warmth rise in his chest, a connection that went beyond words. Lyra was more than a guide in this strange world. She was someone who believed in him, who saw potential in him even when he doubted himself. Well, if I'm going to impress your parents, I have to at least beat you first, he said lightly, breaking the silence. Lyra laughed, the sound like a melody that lifted his spirits. Keep practicing. You might just have a chance. The two of them continued playing until the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the balcony. Jeremiah still had a long way to go before he could hold his own against Threxer, but for the first time he felt like it was possible. He wasn't just learning a game, he was learning to see the world through different eyes. Jeremiah approached the training room with a mix of curiosity and dread. It had been weeks since his first awkward chess match against Threxer, and while his progress with the game was still uneven, the Zeltrian family had begun to warm to him in other ways. Now, Iovala had suggested a different form of bonding, something more active, something more Zeltrian. Lyra had volunteered to be his partner, which both comforted and terrified him. He could handle working with her, but every time he thought of her parents observing their progress, he felt the pressure mount all over again. When he stepped into the room, he was met by walls of glowing panels and hovering platforms. The floor pulsed faintly beneath his feet, and the air carried a hum that hinted at the advanced technology surrounding them. Lyra stood near a central platform, adjusting a set of holographic tools. Her father was there too, looking as calm and authoritative as ever. Threxer greeted him with a polite nod but said nothing more, stepping back into the shadows to observe. Lyra turned toward Jeremiah and smiled. You're just in time. I was starting to think you'd back out. Back out? Jeremiah walked up to her, feigning confidence. Never. I just needed to prepare myself. She smirked, one eyebrow raised. Well, don't worry. I'll guide you through it. This exercise is more about teamwork than perfection. Jeremiah glanced at the floating tools. What exactly are we doing? Lyra tapped one of the holograms, causing a projection of a complex mechanical structure to appear. We're going to assemble this together. Think of it like building a bridge, only the materials are semi-sentient and the instructions change as you go. He blinked. Wait, semi-sentient? What does that mean? It means the components will adapt to how we handle them, she explained. They'll shift their properties if we're out of sync. The goal is to keep everything balanced while we assemble the structure. Balanced, Jeremiah repeated. Got it. No pressure. Lyra laughed and handed him a pair of thin, glove-like devices. Here, put these on. They'll let you interact with the components. I'll do the first part so you can see how it works. Jeremiah slipped on the gloves, flexing his fingers as they lit up with faint trails of energy. He watched as Lyra began moving the semi-transparent pieces into place. She was graceful, precise, her movements fluid and confident. As she worked, the components shifted subtly, almost as if they were responding to her mood. A glowing beam extended between two pieces, stabilizing them. Now you try, she said, stepping back. Just move that support beam over and connect it to the base. Jeremiah reached out tentatively. The beam felt light, almost weightless, but as he moved it, it wobbled slightly, throwing off his grip. It's slippery, he muttered. Focus on your grip, Lyra said. Let the gloves guide you. You don't have to force it. He adjusted his hold, trying to mimic her earlier movements. The beam steadied, and he slowly maneuvered it into place. When it clicked into the base, the structure lit up with a soft glow. Jeremiah exhaled, a small smile forming. Not so bad. See? I told you you'd get it. Lyra stepped beside him, her voice full of encouragement. Now we do the next part together. I'll handle the core component and you guide the stabilizers into position. They worked side by side, their movements gradually falling into a rhythm. Each time Jeremiah hesitated, Lyra offered a quick tip or demonstrated the proper technique. Despite his initial nervousness, he found himself enjoying the process. The floating components felt almost alive, responding to their combined efforts. It was less like building a machine and more like coaxing a living thing into its proper shape. Threxer, who had remained silent until now, spoke up from the corner. You're improving, Jeremiah. Your coordination is much better than when you started. Thanks, Jeremiah said, glancing over his shoulder. Still a long way to go, though. Threxer's expression was difficult to read, but there was a hint of approval in his tone. It's not about perfection. It's about understanding your partner, trusting each other's instincts. Jeremiah looked back at Lyra. I think I've got a pretty good partner. Lyra laughed softly. Flattery will only get you so far. But I'll take it. They continued working, the structure growing more complex with each passing moment. The components tested their coordination, shifting in unexpected ways. More than once, Jeremiah stumbled, causing the entire framework to tremble. But each time Lyra steadied it, her calm voice guiding him back on track. Don't rush, she said as he fumbled with a particularly tricky piece. Take a breath. It's not a race. He nodded, drawing a deep breath before trying again. This time, the piece slid into place without incident. I'm starting to think you'd make a better engineer than me. Lyra shrugged, her expression playful. It's just practice. And a little patience. As they neared completion, the structure took on a life of its own. Energy flowed through the framework, stabilizing each section as it locked into place. The final piece hovered before them, glowing brightly. Ready? Lyra asked, looking at him. Let's finish this, Jeremiah said, smiling. They each reached out, guiding the last piece into positai. Add for a first-timer. Threxer stepped forward, his arms crossed. You did well, both of you. It's not an easy task, even for seasoned teams. Jeremiah glanced at Lyra, his confidence bolstered by her steady presence. I guess I had a good teacher. Lyra's cheeks darkened slightly, but she just shook her head. I told you we'd make it work. Jeremiah felt a warmth in his chest that had little to do with the glowing structure before them. It was in Lyra's voice, her smile, the way she had believed in him even when he doubted himself. In that moment, he knew he was no longer just a guest in this alien world. He was becoming part of something more, something he hadn't even dared to imagine when he first arrived. The bright morning sun filtered through the crystalline walls of the estate, casting soft rainbows on the floor as Jeremiah shuffled into the dining room. He hadn't planned to be awake so early, but restlessness had driven him from bed. To his surprise, he wasn't the only one awake. Threxer was already seated at the small table near the balcony, a steaming cup of dark Zeltrian brew in hand. A holographic chessboard floated between them, its glowing pieces idling in a neutral position. Threxer glanced up, his silver eyes meeting Jeremiah's with a quiet intensity. Couldn't sleep? Not really, Jeremiah admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. Something on my mind. Threxer gestured to the chair opposite him. Sit. Perhaps a game will help clear your thoughts. Jeremiah hesitated, recalling his first match against the Zeltrian patriarch. The memory of Threxer's sharp, calculated moves still made him wince. I'm not sure I'm ready to play you again. This isn't about winning or losing, Threxer said, his tone measured. It's about understanding. Sit. With a reluctant shrug, Jeremiah lowered himself into the chair. The holographic pieces sprang to life, arranging themselves into their starting positions. He flexed his fingers and adjusted his gloves, hoping they wouldn't betray his nerves. What's been troubling you? Threxer asked, his voice calm as he moved a piece to open the match. Jeremiah countered cautiously, studying the shifting patterns. It's just, everything's so different here. I'm still trying to figure out where I fit in. Back on Earth, I knew what was expected of me. Here, I feel like I'm constantly guessing. Threxer made another move, his expression unreadable. Every new experience requires adjustment. But the question is, why does it matter so much to you? Are you trying to prove something? Jeremiah frowned. I don't know. Maybe. I just don't want to disappoint anyone. That's a burden you place on yourself, Threxer replied, leaning back slightly. But you don't have to carry it alone. Jeremiah's next move was hesitant, the piece shimmering as it slid into place. You're saying I should just let go? No, Threxer said. I'm saying that you must trust those around you. Rely on them. A strong bond doesn't come from perfection, it comes from persistence and support. Jeremiah glanced at him, then back at the board. Like Lyra? Yes. Threxer nodded. She has chosen to stand by you. That means something. They played in silence for a few moves, the board's patterns growing more intricate. Jeremiah could see the traps forming, the avenues Threxer was setting up to pin him. Yet, instead of panicking, he studied them more carefully. His moves weren't as fast as Threxer's, but they were becoming more deliberate. I still don't get why you let me try the first time, Jeremiah said after a moment. You must have known I'd fail. Threxer's lips curled slightly in what might have been a faint smile. Perhaps. But failure is part of learning. I wanted to see how you handled it. Jeremiah stared at the board, thinking. I guess I just kept going. And that is why you're here now, Threxer said. You didn't give up. That speaks more than a victory ever could. They played on, each move a step in an unspoken conversation. Jeremiah felt his confidence grow as he recognized patterns he hadn't noticed before. Threxer's attacks were still sharp, but they no longer felt overwhelming. For the first time, Jeremiah felt like he could hold his own, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because he understood the game just a little better than before. As the match drew to a close, Lyra appeared in the doorway, her hair catching the morning light. She looked between them, a knowing smile on her face. You two started without me? Threxer leaned back, crossing his arms. Your partner is improving. Lyra raised an eyebrow. Oh? Should I be worried? Jeremiah grinned, feeling a spark of pride. Maybe. I might even give you a run for your money next time. She laughed and walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. We'll see. For now, breakfast is ready. Threxer nodded, gesturing toward the table. Go ahead. I'll join you shortly. As Jeremiah stood, he glanced at the board one last time. The match had been close, far closer than he'd ever expected. He felt a sense of accomplishment, not from winning, but from knowing he could stand in Threxer's presence and hold his own. Lyra led him to the main dining hall, where Iovala was already seated. She greeted him with a warm smile. You're up early. I couldn't sleep, Jeremiah said, sitting down beside Lyra. Ended up having a rematch with Threxer. Iovala's eyes sparkled with amusement. And how did it go? Better than last time, Jeremiah said with a small smile. I think I'm starting to get the hang of it. Good, she said. Patience and persistence are the keys to mastering Zeltrian chess and many other things. As they began eating, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, a new art exhibit in the city, a recent cultural festival Lyra had attended, and a few humorous stories from Iovala's youth. Jeremiah found himself relaxing, laughing at Iovala's sharp wit and Lyra's playful jabs. For the first time since arriving on Zeltria Prime, he felt like he truly belonged at the table. After breakfast, Lyra took Jeremiah on a walk through the estate's expansive gardens. The bioluminescent plants glowed faintly in the daylight, their colors shifting as they passed. They walked in companionable silence for a while before she finally spoke. My father respects you, she said. Jeremiah glanced at her. What makes you say that? The way he talks to you. He wouldn't have invited you to another game if he didn't think you were worth the effort. He stopped, turning to face her. I wasn't sure he even liked me. Lyra smiled softly. He doesn't give praise lightly, but he sees your determination. That's something he values. They continued walking, the path winding through an orchard of strange, translucent trees. Lyra reached out, plucking a fruit that shimmered like liquid silver. She handed it to Jeremiah, who turned it over in his hands. "Try it," she said. He took a bite, the flavor both sweet and slightly tangy, unlike anything he'd ever tasted. "Not bad," he said, smiling. Lyra laughed. "It's a local favorite. I thought you might like it." As they walked on, the conversation turned to their plans for the future. Lyra spoke of her research projects and her desire to bridge the cultural gap between humans and Zeltrians. Jeremiah shared his thoughts on what he could bring from Earth, ideas that might complement Zeltrian advancements. By the time they returned to the estate, the sun was high in the sky, and Jeremiah felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was part of something larger, something that had the potential to grow into a partnership between two worlds. And as Lyra's hand brushed his when they reached the doorway, he realized that partnership meant more than just chess and diplomacy. It meant understanding, trust, and a connection he hadn't dared to hope for. The soft hum of the estate's energy fields seemed to match Jeremiah's steady breaths as he stood in the open-air garden terrace, watching the twin suns dip below the horizon. The colors of the sky, crimson and deep gold, blended with the crystalline structures around him, creating a serene, almost otherworldly backdrop. He wasn't sure how long he'd been standing there, but the sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. "Enjoying the view?" Lyra asked, stepping up beside him. Her shimmering hair caught the fading sunlight, giving her an ethereal glow. Jeremiah turned to her, a small smile forming. "It's peaceful. Makes you forget about everything else." She leaned on the railing, looking out over the alien landscape. "I come here sometimes when I need to think. It's easy to get lost in the noise, the expectations. But this," she gestured to the horizon, "this helps me clear my head." "I can see why," he said, following her gaze. "Back on Earth, I'd go to this little spot by the river when things got overwhelming. Not quite as stunning as this, but it did the trick." Lyra glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's funny. You always talk about Earth as if it's light years away, but you carry so much of it with you. The way you approach things, the way you see the world, it's all still there." Jeremiah shrugged. "I guess that's just part of who I am. Even here, I can't shake where I came from." "And you shouldn't," she said firmly. "It's what makes you, you." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Lyra turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. "You've changed, since you first got here." "Have I?" he asked, his voice soft. "I don't feel all that different." "You are," she said, her tone serious. "You've become more patient, more confident. You're not afraid to make mistakes, to learn from them. My parents see it too." Jeremiah let out a quiet laugh. "Threxer's approval still feels like winning a championship." Lyra chuckled. "You earned it. And it wasn't just about chess or any of those tests. It was about how you handled yourself, how you worked with me, how you listened, how you never gave up." "I guess I had good motivation," Jeremiah said, his eyes locking with hers. The air around them seemed to shift, growing warmer. Lyra tilted her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "What kind of motivation?" Jeremiah hesitated, then took a half-step closer. "You," he said simply. She blinked, her expression softening. "Jeremiah." Before he could second-guess himself, he leaned in, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers intertwined with his, her grip steady. Their first kiss was tentative, a moment of uncertainty and discovery. But as their lips met again, it deepened, becoming something more. The world around them faded, leaving only the warmth of her touch and the gentle press of her lips. When they finally pulled back, Lyra rested her forehead against his, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that." Jeremiah smiled, his heart racing. "I was afraid I'd mess it up." She laughed softly. "You didn't." They stood there, wrapped in each other's presence, until the sky turned dark and the stars emerged. The constellations were unfamiliar to Jeremiah, but in that moment it didn't matter. All he cared about was the feeling of Lyra's hand in his, the closeness they now shared. Later, as they walked back toward the estate, Lyra spoke. We still have a lot to figure out, about how this works. Jeremiah nodded. I know, but we'll figure it out together. She squeezed his hand. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I'm here too, he said, meaning every word. When they reached the door, Lyra paused, turning to face him. Tomorrow I want to show you something. Something important. What is it? He asked. She smiled mysteriously. You'll see. Just be ready early. Jeremiah nodded, curiosity piqued. I'll be ready. That night, as he lay in bed, Jeremiah replayed the evening's events in his mind. For the first time since coming to Zeltria Prime, he felt truly at peace. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't facing this journey alone. Aufgeben.